This is the first time that a professional editor will be reading my writing. In a few days, I will be sending my manuscript that I've been working on for over a year and a half to a developmental editor. Hi, I'm Lily. I'm on the journey of self-publishing my first book in 2025, and I'm here to share the journey of all the ups and downs, trials and errors, everything I learned along the way. I know hiring editors is a big part of that process, and I was super intimidated for a long time. But I've finally figured it out, and I'm about to send my manuscript in a few days, and I'm more excited than nervous. I've known I wanted to self-publish for a long time, but the process is very intimidating and confusing for someone who's never been through it before. I know for traditional publishing, people usually recommend to not hire a professional editor because when you go into the trad pub route, you are going to get a literary agent and a editor in the house that you publish in. For self-publishing, I've known that editing is the most expensive cost by far. And with that pressure of making sure that it is a good investment in your book, I've been really intimidated of the process of sending my book to your professional editor. Not only that, but also the thought of someone seeing your writing for the first time and getting that feedback can be really scary. I've been through maybe 3 to 5 rounds of self edits, and this includes giant rewrites and also line edits. I've been working with this story for a long time, and it gets to a point where you can't change it anymore. You've gotten to a point where you've made it the best you can make it, and then you need that professional feedback. I had a hard time trying to figure out like when I wanted to hire a professional editor, how I wanted this to look. Some people like to do beta readers before professional editing, and other people like to do it after. I did a lot of research, but at the end of the day, my intuition told me that now is the time. So I got my book to the best it could be. And then I got some alpha reader feedback. I chose a few people close in my life and I gave the book to them and they gave me some really great feedback. I was at a point in my story where I could identify problems, but I needed more of a professional eye to the story. So I've had about a month and a half to edit my book and polish it and get it to the best possible point it can get before I send it off. Right now, I'm working with a developmental editor. This is a bit different than a copy editor or a line editor, and most editors will do like different types of edits. I don't know if I'm going to do a developmental edit for every book in the future, but I definitely want to invest in the first book that I publish because I know that not only is this an investment in your story, but it's an investment in your own skills as well. One of my goals is to eventually start freelance editing for writers. So I've been taking courses myself. And the more that I've learned about editing, the more that I've realized that developmental editing is so crucial to how a story like hangs together. No matter how good you think your story is, there's so much more to look at. I'm really excited to invest in my education because I think hiring a developmental editor will also help me figure out how to edit myself. I'm just really excited to just have my story kind of ripped to shreds. Like I know that it has a lot of issues with it, but it also has a lot of potential. And I think that is something that I'm really excited to see if they agree with or what parts that really stick with them. I do plan on doing a round of beta readers after I have this book a bit more like fleshed out. I know people do multiple rounds of beta readers sometimes, but I don't want to waste people's attention and give them a book that is going to end up being ripped apart later. Since I've gotten my feedback from the alpha readers, I've been doing a lot of editing on my book to make sure it's polished as much as it can before I send it off. I think a lot of people are like this, where when you first start editing, you like sit down and you're ready to edit and you're like, okay, I'm going to do like one chapter a day. And it ends up taking you like 3 days to edit one chapter. And I think it's so easy to get caught up in all the details and overthink every edit you make. And I've kind of gotten it down to a system where I like to edit really fast. And this might seem like counterintuitive, but trust me, like I actually think this is really important because when I try to edit slow, I get really stuck in the story. Once I noticed that it was taking me like multiple days to get through 1 or 2 chapters, I was realizing that I needed to pick up the pace because I had a deadline on when I was sending my manuscript off. And I think deadlines are also really helpful in like making sure you're efficient with your time. I started reading through my manuscript and I would change things as I go. If I made an edit, I would leave it. I wouldn't change something more than once. Or if I had a really strong issue with something and I didn't feel right about it, I would highlight it, but I would move on. I was able to get through my like 98,000 word manuscript in a couple weeks just doing that. I've gone through edits so many times that you can only edit something so much. So, because I'm so far into the journey, I am really going fast with my edits. And then now I've gotten to the point where I've went through my entire manuscript once after feedback, and I've implemented a ton of like random rewrites and small changes here and there. And I'm going to read through it again to polish it this time and check again. Where, like, if I make an edit and I read through like 3 times, and every time I read through it, I don't change it because I think it's okay. It probably is okay. But if I read through it again and I'm like, okay, like, I need to change this again, it kind of shows me like every time I read through something, like what is okay to keep and what isn't. Reading through quickly 3 times is more efficient for me than reading through slowly once. And I'm going to read it like I normally would, like a manuscript. And I'm going to go through and check the changes I made and see if they jump out to me or if they don't. So that's what I wanted to do today, where I wanted to go through my story and read it and talk about my thoughts. When I was first editing, I didn't know what to look for or what sort of things to have on my mind. And whenever I make editing vlogs where I'm going through and like preparing things and like talking it out loud, not only does it help myself, but I think sharing it could help other people that are also trying to edit their book for the first time and they're trying to think of like what to look for. So I have my computer right here and I'm going to open up to my manuscript. I use Scrivener. As much as I want my book to be the best it can be before I send it off, I also have to realize that it's the editor's job to find issues and they're expecting an imperfect manuscript. So instead of focusing on how perfect can I make it, I'm trying to focus on how accurately can I make it to my vision. The closer the story is to the final vision, the more the editor's notes are going to be helpful and really speak to me. It's called Project Rooted. I've mentioned this before. This is my debut YA fantasy romance novel. I don't really have like a proper pitch for it because I think that's like the hardest thing as a writer sometimes. If you've followed me in any of my socials, I talk about the story as the one that has flower magic, where it's a world where nature runs magic. And it's a girl who's an heir to a throne. This whole story of like finding the truth and finding herself. I'm going to read my story out loud, and that's how I pick up on a lot of issues. What I've noticed with my work is every time I read through it, I'm trying to make as many connections as possible. And I heard this advice somewhere about plotting, where plotting is just making as many intricate connections as possible with different characters and different arcs and world building and like conflicts. It's a web of like everything connecting. I'm trying to make my story feel as cohesive as possible. And whenever you have those little like foreshadowed Easter eggs or like spots that just fit so beautifully together, it makes the story feel so much more real. Feed in those bigger things that are going to connect later on and not make my story feel like 2 separate stories, but like one full cohesive story. I need to add more action beats in my plot, where sometimes I have a scene where the setting isn't super active, like it's not interacting with the characters, or there's a lot of dialogue, but there's not a lot of intentional action happening, where I'll kind of add like little action beats to make it seem like it's more live. But either like whether they're sitting somewhere, they're walking, they're talking, like there usually has to be like some sort of intentional action going on to make it feel real and like jump off the page. I've been so focused on like the conflict and the dialogue and everything like that that I feel like some of my scenes feel a bit flat because the actions I'm giving the characters aren't necessarily very active. I want to make sure also that my setting is very active, where sometimes I'll have like them in like a library room or like a ballroom or something, and I want to make the setting interact with the characters. And I've been learning about that, where I feel like my setting sometimes doesn't interact with the characters very well, where it's more of a backdrop and less of like a character itself. I have an issue with details, where if there's details about food or locations, I'm not as interested in those things. And I've noticed that I keep using the term fresh bread, where apparently that's the only food they eat in this universe. Small details like that help make a world feel more real. So I want to focus on that. But again, because I'm about to send this to a developmental editor, I'm not going to spend my time focusing on like those small details. I'm going to kind of like make a note of it and then like keep going because I want to make sure I'm catching the big things. I'm just cleaning up the reading as much as possible. Where yes, I'm not focusing on grammar and like syntax and stuff, but I also want to make sure that the reading experience isn't distracted by all those errors and the editor can focus on the bigger issues at stake. Because my book is a fantasy book, I've noticed that sometimes I have words that describe things that the word choice sometimes feels a bit out of place. Like, for example, I mentioned school, but I feel like maybe academy or something else might be a bit more fitting for this time. Something that I was trying to focus on when I was editing this was creating tension in every scene. Where I used to think that conflict was only like big arguments, but tension and subtle tension is something that I love to read about and I love to write. And for example, I have a scene where the main character and her mother are getting ready for a big ceremony. At first, I kind of had it as just like a way to share information and share the protagonist's inner world. Every dynamic is going to have its own relationship, but the dynamic between the protagonist and her mother is very unique and very complicated, and it's directly correlated to the plot, whether it was in dialogue or the setting or action. I wanted to show that subtle tension where it kind of feeds the reader like a promise of tension and conflict in the future. Tension is the promise of future conflict. That this is a really good example. Mom's eyes dart to my hands. Be careful, the silk is fragile. I drop the skirt of the dress. The mom's eyes darting to her hands is very like it shows the dynamic of the mom being a bit more like on top of her or uptight in the fact that she reacts so quickly and so like correct to how her mother wishes. It kind of shows their dynamic of like this is their dynamic to start and then it's going to shift and change as the story progresses. It's promising conflict in the future. Right here, the mom says, there's nothing to be scared of. You've trained for this. And what's interesting is I also say that mom's hands slightly shake around the velvet bag. So her actions are conflicting with her words. And that is such a good way to show subtle tension. Words are saying that there's nothing to worry about, it's okay. But her actions are subtly showing that she's nervous or she's anxious or she's scared by shaking her hands. I'm biased. I love this story. Like it is I love it so much. This story has grown with me as a writer. It's really exciting that someone else will be able to read it, and even if they're like give me like I know this story so well that I'm so excited for it to actually like start being in the hands of other people. I'm interested to see if this editor will have anything to say about how I introduce characters because sometimes I feel like my descriptions of characters aren't very detailed, and I'm curious to see if they can picture them and visualize them and if they have anything to say about that. I just thought of a potential plot point right now. Instead of thinking of new ideas, I'm trying to think of how can I connect existing ideas in my story to make everything just feel more cohesive. I'll probably implement the idea that I came up with later on in the story, but I just wrote it down. What's really cool about reading my story back is I notice small like pockets of symbolism which aren't necessarily intentional, but almost subconsciously I put it in my story. I'm getting to the point where I'm reading through my story and I have nothing to change. And that doesn't mean that I think it's perfect or that it's the best it can be. It's that I've changed everything to the point that I can get it to. I just read the first chapter and I'm reading the second chapter right now. I don't have a lot to change. And that's why I think right now is the perfect time for a professional editor. You've hit the wall of your skill and ability, and now it's time to bring it to someone else so they can help you figure out how to make it even better. I love this story. It's my taste exactly to a T, where everything about it is exactly what I love in books. And it's so exciting to see it come to life and then being able to read it back and like enjoy it from a reader perspective and not a writer. When I send my book off to the developmental editor, I think the contract is about 3 weeks. And then once I get it back, I'm going to dive into edits again. But I do think it's good to give myself that break. And honestly, this might be too ambitious, but whatever. When my book is with my editor, I'm going to be working on drafting my second book and they're not in the same series. It's a different book completely, but because I'm self-publishing, I want to start getting as many books out there to build my skill and my foundation. I hope that was helpful. It wasn't a ton, but it was kind of a bit in depth about like how I edit, what I think about while I'm editing, how I'm preparing my manuscript for sending it to a professional editor. Yeah, so thanks for watching and happy writing.